The views, information, or opinions expressed in this broadcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not represent those of any other persons or entities. Furthermore, some of the activities discussed might be dangerous or illegal. Attempt them at your own risk. Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of The Peculiar World here on the Paranormal UK radio network. I'm your host, Jeff Davis. I'm excited about tonight's show, and I hope you are as well, or will become so after I tell you a little bit about it. Tonight, my guest and I will talk about World War I. Okay, please don't tune out yet, at least until I tell you what we're going to talk about. Going to talk about some of the odd and unusual happenings and coincidences surrounding World War I and its aftermath. These are some legends that aren't quite true and other legends that really are. We're going to talk about the peculiar way the war began with a failed assassination attempt which eventually succeeded because somebody took a wrong turn. We'll talk about spectral bowmen, or was it angels? And was there really a lost battalion in the U.S. in World War I, or were they merely misplaced? And what happened to their commander? There's the legacy of World War I, which continues into our world today. Did you know that the Treaty of Versailles ordered the Germans to surrender the skull of an African chief to the British government? And even now, bodies of fallen soldiers are still being found in many different battlefields. Now, to make sense of these unusual events, my guest is a renowned historian and scholar of World War I. Between the two of us, we'll touch on these people and events. Before you meet him, let's give you just a little few seconds and factoids on World War I itself. Ask most Americans when World War I started and they'll say, and I quote, "Huh?" And some variation of, "Was there a world war before we fought Hitler in the 1940s? Then most of them will think, and those who studied American history will say, proudly, 1917 to 1918. They're close. Those are the days when the United States entered the war until the Armistice or ceasefire. However, in reality, World War I began on the 28th of July, 1914. America didn't join the war until the 6th of April, 1917, and fighting lasted until the 11th of November, when all the combatants declared an armistice or ceasefire. That is, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of that year. However, the war did not officially end, legally, until all of the combatants ratified and signed the Treaty of Versailles on the 28th of June, 1919. So we are still just a few months away, as I speak into my microphone, from the real 100-year anniversary of the end of World War I. Now, Armistice Day itself is also known today as Veterans Day in the United States, and the war was known then as the Great War, or the War to End All Wars, and sadly, it was not. Now, in the war, the combatants were divided into two sides. On the Allied side were the British, French, Belgians, Russians, the United States, and many, many other countries, including, ironically, Japan, who became one of the Axis powers in World War II with Germany. Now, the Central Powers, the bad guys, were represented by Germany, Austria-Hungarian Empire, Turkey, and they had their own allies in these smaller countries. Oftentimes historians will divide casualty numbers, the dead, wounded, and so on, into our side versus their side. In the light of World War I, I prefer to just give you the combined numbers. Between both sides, they lost nearly 10 million members of the military, 20 million others wounded, and nearly 8 million civilian dead. This was one of these wars where if you were even close to the battlefield, or even say 10 or 12 miles away, you might actually die by shelling, bombs, and so on. And these are only estimates. Even today, people are still finding the remains of those declared missing in action, or simply missing or forgotten. During the war and its aftermath, the entire world, particularly Europe and North America, were changed forever. Many of Europe's ruling families were removed from power, and their empires were divided into separate countries. There were revolts and communism and Marxism replaced some of these older, more traditional governments in these experiments by the people, for the people, and ultimately some were for the people, but not all. In the United States, the country had mechanized itself to support the war effort and became established as not just a military but an industrial world power combined. And the seeds of World War II were sown in the social, economic, and political upheaval. In those uncertain times, many people needed legends and hopes, which may account for some of the stories we'll discuss tonight. Everyone, this is kind of an unusual, even peculiar, Jeff Davis's peculiar world, because I'm not trying to prove anything is odd and unusual. In this case, I'm trying to, in a way, disprove or enlighten people on what was odd and unusual. And this has to do with World War I. My guest is my friend Mitch Yockelson. I should say Dr. Mitchell Yockelson. And let me read you a little bit about his bio. He is the chief historian for the United States World War I Centennial Commission. He is also an investigative archivist with the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, Archival Recovery Program, ARP. Mitch has authored articles and book reviews in various journals and magazines, and has written 4 books. His most recent, 47 Days, How Pershing's Warriors Came of Age to Defeat the German Army in World War I, and that was published by the New American Library Press in 2016. Mitch received a bachelor's degree from Frostburg State University, a master's from George Mason University, and holds a PhD from the Royal Military College of Science, Cranfield University, UK. So he went to the UK for his advanced degree. I went to UK Sheffield, University of Sheffield, for my archaeology degree. But even more important to me is how I met Mitch, because it was one of these personal projects of mine, investigating military history and promoting it about the Vancouver Barracks in Vancouver, Washington. I took a chance. We were having, in 2018, because it is a centennial of World War I, we were having a history conference about World War I, both regionally as well as internationally, and I took a chance and contacted Mitch at the National Archives, and he agreed to be our keynote speaker. So he flew all the way out here, got caught in the Portland, Oregon traffic jam, coming back from Powell's Books, but he gave an enlightening and tone-setting talk to open our conference. So I would like to introduce Mitch Yockelson to everybody. Welcome, Mitch.
Thanks, Jeff. It's a pleasure to speak to you again. It's been a while, and that was a wonderful experience for me to be at Vancouver Barracks, which is such a historic spot. So many of our storied military figures had spent some time or another out there. So for me, it was a huge thrill to have you show me around and walk me around where George C. Marshall and Grant and others had been. It was just a cool time. So thanks for reaching out to me again.
Well, and I appreciate your time. And it's interesting. I think both of us kind of complement each other in this interview, because when I contacted you, you pointed out your specialty is the American experience in World War I. And some of what I wanted to talk about goes back to some of my earlier research when I was in the United Kingdom doing my graduate program. So we kind of complement each other, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be fun just kind of having a banter with you and your knowledge, and I'll try and keep up with you.
Oh, no, I'm sure, because World War I really is your specialty. I'm sure what I think I'm up on, because I kind of have this broad spectrum, you'll still be picking me apart, and that's okay.
Let's get into it.
Okay. Well, one of the things I think most historians, military historians, agree with is many wars, you can't really pick how it began. Sometimes the war just seems to have started. There's no one signal event that seemed to say, wow, this one thing we know directly started the war. This is not true in the case of World War I. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. I mean, we look back on the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie is sort of the tinder that got things going. But World War I think, was inevitable. How Europe was doing it well economically in 1914, but there were so many different factions, jealousies, that it was really a matter of time before a war started. And I think that the assassination really was just an excuse to go to war. What do you think?
I agree with you entirely. It's sad, but the assassination took place in Sarajevo and was now Bosnia. And the Balkans for thousands of years have been a transportation point from people going from essentially Turkey and Asia into Europe. So it's almost fate.
Yes. I mean, it's hard for Americans to imagine what this would have been like. I mean, we're extremely lucky. What happened during that course of 4 years, starting in June of 1914 and continuing on until November 1908, so much of the infrastructure of Europe was destroyed, not to mention the millions of lives that were lost, both civilian and military, and it started in that area. Obviously, there wouldn't have been a Second World War. There wouldn't have been the rise of Hitler had that assassination not taken place. It's one of the interesting things, I think, hopefully you'll agree with me, one of the fun things about history is to look at the what-ifs. If, this hadn't happened, that hadn't happened. If the Archduke and Sophie, maybe they went down a different street and the would-be assassin wasn't there. And look at how things, just slight differences might have changed an outcome.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is almost like fate stepped in, and of course that's one of the first set of legends about World War I that still come down to us, that people still repeat. And I'll share with our listeners, because this broadcast is heard on the Paranormal UK radio network, which is based out of England. We just got the stats, and I think on average people from 36 countries listen to these broadcasts and podcasts. But it is almost like fate that the assassination happened, because it almost didn't, and then all of a sudden by chance it did. It was June. Right. Yeah. It was June.
I was going to ask you a question before we get into the nitty gritty. As I understand it, you were in Bosnia in the 1990s. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
And you walked across the bridge right where the assassination happened. Am I correct on that?
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. I don't know what the name of the bridge was then, but when I was walking across it every day, I was there as part of the whole peacekeeping mission that the United States was into, and we just call it the Franz Ferdinand Bridge.
And was it weird walking around? Did you feel any sort of energy that this great presence, this great event happened?
I was aware of what had happened. It was to kind of talk to people about it. And again, some European folk may have visited Sarajevo, or they actually may be listening from Sarajevo. Back almost over 20 years ago, the whole nation was still in shreds and tatters. And Sarajevo, too. I remember they had small mortars, I think 40 or 60 millimeter mortars, and the mortarmen were actually setting off the mortars over buildings over the next block over. And where they struck on the sidewalk in the streets, they would leave, of course, where the mortar explosive pin was on the sidewalk, there would be a small hole. And then where the shrapnel, where it exploded out from around that center, there were other cuts in the concrete. And we called them Sarajevo roses. And the local people, where all these strikes were, these mortar strikes or artillery strikes were, they actually filled it in with kind of a red plastic, which really reinforced that Sarajevo rose effect. So there I was, walking every day to work. I resided at a building called the Parliament Building, and then I went to the residency. So every day I would put on my shoulder holster and make sure my pistol was loaded, and I would walk through the streets of Sarajevo. We had rules, no one goes alone anywhere, and so there would be groups of 2 to 5 or 6 of us wandering through the streets of the city where World War I began. How do I put it? At first, it was an eerie experience, and I really felt the significance of the bridge, knowing what happened there. Having told you that, Mitch, it was also interesting that you got used to it. I guess.
In what way?
Well, it was normalized. If you're always worried about being shot at, you're going to go crazy. You've got to not let down your guard, but you've got to accept it as part of the normal environment, which is why people in the combat zone oftentimes reporters or outsiders will come in and they say, "Aren't you worried?" And you say, "Worrying hurt or help rather." And so it was kind of that way. Yeah. I do remember.
Yeah, that's something.
Go ahead.
It's something that's completely foreign to me and foreign to so many Americans. I point out some of our listeners are in areas that perhaps have been war zones and maybe remain so. But as an American growing up on the East Coast, I've always had a serene surrounding. So to hear you talk about being in Bosnia in a war zone, literally, were very foreign to me.
And this reminds me, too, since I'm not in a whole priority to direct everything right to World War I, I've had some people actually say to me, liberal and conservative, they're so frustrated. What they've said is, what we need is a little civil war to kind of reestablish order in this country, which to me really means to make people do what my side wants them to do. And I'm actually horrified at that, not at the sincerity of these people, but at their ignorance. The most memorable thing, when I originally got in Sarajevo, I flew in on I think a helicopter or something. So I'm at the airport, and they're shuttling me from the airport into Sarajevo, and we're driving for several miles, it seems, down this road, and lining the road on the right-hand side, I remember what was the Olympic Village. A few years earlier, they'd had the Winter Olympics in Sarajevo, and so they built these kind of circus-colored, very bright buildings out of concrete for everybody to stay in as part of the Olympic complex, and they were just devastated. They were artillery shells, and they were in pieces, and reinforced concrete and rusting rebar, and kind of tucked in to a lot of the sides of these buildings were hand-built shelters and tents where they were using plastic that had been wrapping crates of aid materials. They had these United Nations stamped plastics, and they were turning those into shelters. So when people tell me we need just a little civil war to fix things, it's so tragic when you see what a country does to itself, let alone when it's invaded by outsiders. I'm sorry, I'm soapboxing. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I dragged you in that direction, but it just kind of shows, really, when I look back 100 years, and once the war started, that's probably what a lot of Europe was like, just the way you described it.
Yeah. And later I was assigned to kind of an outlying city and base, and my civil affairs cell ran the interpreter pool. Our interpreters represented all three ethnicities, and all of them were told by their leadership, if you will, within 2 weeks you'll be home in good Serbian Bosnia, or you'll be at your house in good Catholic Bosnia. Yeah, so much for the peculiar. Well, what's peculiar is people actually believed it.
Yeah.
Kind of long silence from both of us. Sorry, listeners.
Yeah, there's really not much to say. So let's get back to 1914 to 1980.
Yeah, a little bit. Well, a long distance makes it easier to talk about with a bit less passion. To clear background, as Mitch and I have been talking around things, it was June 28th, 1914, in Sarajevo. And that area had just been annexed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And kind of part of a goodwill mission, the heir to the throne, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, decided to visit Bosnia-Herzegovina. And they, among other things, they had to visit Sarajevo. And there were a group of disaffected students, perhaps egged on by the Serbian Special Intelligence, who planned to kill him when he was in Sarajevo. And they divided into groups, and they waited at various places in Sarajevo with their primary weapon was going to be bombs, and their backup were pistols. It's like at first fate seemed to favor Franz Ferdinand. He and his wife were in an open touring car, and one of these cells of revolutionaries or students threw a bomb at them. The bomb bounced off of the canvas back of the car and exploded under another car that was following as part of their entourage. But Archduke and his wife were perfectly fine. So they continued on in their tour. But where fate and human decision step in was that later in the tour, the Archduke said, let's detour and let's go to the hospital to see these people. After all, they were injured in our service. So they directed the driver to take them to the hospital, and that meant crossing this one bridge. However, they were going the wrong way on the bridge. And so they ended up stopping. It was a policeman or somebody else said, hey, you're going the wrong way. So they couldn't back the car up. I guess it didn't have a reverse gear. Mm-hmm. And it just so happened that one of the would-be assassins, a man named Gavrilo Princip, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong to those people from Bosnia-Herzegovina, but he was actually kind of disheartened, and he was standing on the street, and lo and behold, his attention is attracted by Franz Ferdinand's car. He stepped forward just a little bit. He couldn't get his bomb out of his pocket, so he pulled out his pistol, and according to his own testimony, he pointed it in the general direction, turned his head, closed his eyes, and pulled the trigger twice. And one bullet hit Franz Ferdinand, the other bullet hit his wife, hit her in the stomach, and she died, I think, immediately. And Franz Ferdinand lasted just a couple seconds. His jugular vein was severed, and he bled to death right there. And if that's not fate stepping in.
Yes.
And
wow.
Yeah. And of course, years afterward, people are making up, or with historical contexts, finding reasons why this happened, maybe even creating the legends or trying to make sense of it. According to one person it sounds a little contemporary, we know Franz Ferdinand was an avid hunter, and in his own lifetime may have killed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of animals. He's supposed to have killed a white hart deer, which is bad luck. I'm not sure if he really did, but it doesn't sound beyond the pale. But a lot of legends grew up about the car. Have you heard about the car?
No, tell me.
Well, this car was actually a loaner. This car did not belong to, it was not a special purchase by Franz Ferdinand. It was actually loaned to them. And according to legends, after the war was over with, somebody bought it, and they fixed it up because it had been under private ownership, and they decided to drive it. And that supposedly a number of car wrecks took place from that. One of the owners was supposed to have been a race car driver, because I suppose in the 1920s, driving a car that goes 25 miles an hour was pretty speedy. But no seatbelts, and he's supposedly thrown from the car and broke his neck. And the last story about it is supposedly that it was in a museum in Vienna, and that the museum curator so loved the car, even though people have been telling him and everybody else, a number of people have died with this, that he was sitting at the wheel of the car in World War II, and that an Allied bomb came through the roof. And
wow.
Yeah, and blew up the car and him, and all they found was his two hands clenching the steering wheel of the car. So with stories like that, of course, I decided to investigate. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think it's certainly plausible. In going back to the white hart deal?
Yeah.
Deer, I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, it's what goes around comes around, as Shakespeare once said. So all of this is certainly plausible.
Yeah. Now, but some of it, in digging into it, I found that actually the car still exists. I guess if you happen to be from Vienna, probably know that, but apparently it's in the War Museum there. So
really?
Yeah, so at least the last guy is clutching the wheel. Apparently that didn't happen. It doesn't seem to fit some of the legendary facts, but one of the more interesting facts about it that is true is the license plate of the car. There was a photo.
Okay, tell me that.
Yeah, well, there's a photograph taken of the car just moments before it got stuck on the bridge, and the license plate has a capital A, then a little bit of a space, and 3 capital I's, and a little bit of space, and then the number's 118. So it's A, I, space 118. And someone came to the conclusion, thinking about World War I. Does that make you think of anything?
Say that again. 118.
Yeah, it's
yeah. Well, yeah. The date of the Armistice, right?
Yeah.
The 1-1. Yeah.
Yeah, somebody kind of drew the conclusion, and again, this may be fitting facts to behind your theory. It's A, capital I, then 118. That's Armistice, the A, 11/11/11/1918. So that if you start drawing lines, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of the year 1918. So is a real historic fact, if coincidence, or because my show is The Peculiar World, it is kind of peculiar.
It certainly is. Wow. I had not heard that.
And you know what? Surprising Mitch Yockelson with a World War I factoid makes me feel better.
Well, that's the fun thing also about history is, regardless of how much you think you know, there's so much more to learn, and just it's fun talking with people like you, Jeff, who take things in a somewhat different direction, and it makes sense.
Well, and it's good. See, one of the things that I think you and I did talk about when you were here live is sometimes mainstream historians really turn off non-professionals. People are still interested in history, but let's face it, not interested in reading War and Peace. They might want to, watch the 30-minute version on YouTube or something. But you find interesting things about history, and that brings people in and accept it. That's my opinion.
Oh, absolutely. For anyone to enjoy, you don't have to have advanced degrees like I have. Just have an open mind, really.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. And I'm kind of taking us time-wise through the war itself very soon, because you're going to talk about part of the American mythos that grew up about World War I. But the one more thing about kind of the British mythos of the World War I. Have you heard of the Angels of Mons?
I have. I don't know much about them, but it's one of the legends, if you will, of World War I. Mons, of course, was an important battle. British, not a successful battle. They ended up retreating from there, and it's one of the early battles that proved that the war was not going to be won overnight, but it was going to drag on as a more defensive war. But tell me what you know about the Angels of Mons.
Well, yeah, and you can cross-check and fact-check me on this one. What I've got from this one is, at first, shortly after the battle, a newspaper article was written or aired that suggested British witnesses on the battlefield had seen what looked to them to be the phantoms or apparitions of medieval English longbowmen, and that they stood between the British host and the advancing Germans and fired arrows at the Germans. So they either killed or scared the Germans enough that it slowed them down, and then the British were able to kind of make their stand, so to speak, reinforce themselves.
Wow.
I don't know if you've heard that part of it or not, but digging into this, there actually is the story actually did appear. There was in September of 1914, there was a British author, Arthur. He was Welsh, so I'm going to get this pronunciation wrong. Arthur Machen, and he actually wrote a short story that was supposed to be fictional about that very thing. What ended up happening is, initially it was going to be in the segment in the newspaper, Our Short Story, which let everybody know it was a fictional story. But somehow fate stepped in, and the story actually ran under a regular header.
Huh.
Yeah, not the fiction. And and he's supposed to have said, hey, it was fiction, and it got republished several times. And because he was the author, people asked his permission. And so he ended up trying to, every time that somebody reprinted it, this is fiction, this is fiction. And eventually there was a book that came out, The Bowmen and Other Legends of the War, and he wrote the introduction to that. And I found it so fascinating that people wouldn't let it go as an act of fiction. And
desperately wanted it to be real, right?
Yeah, and there are other of these legends. I guess is tied into the psychological phenomena of needing to be right. That eventually this seemed to have morphed into a band of angels, some kind of a supernatural force that were glowing with light in wings and flaming swords to stop the advancing Germans.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and I think people were looking for something to help them understand the war, and they were looking for stories and maybe things that might seem apocryphal because they couldn't understand what was going on. And as you point out, September 1914 was the first true turning point of the war, and that's when Germans were unable to advance as they cut through on the Schlieffen Plan, and the British and the French weren't able to push them out, and that's when they all kind of just threw up their hands and said, okay, this is going to go on for a long time. And then you start to hear these stories coming out, and it makes the war sort of larger than life in a way.
Yeah. Did that kind of phenomena happen in the United States or with the American troops, that destiny was on their side?
Not so much, not a little bit. I mean, the one story that I was going to mention occurred in what was the last offensive of the war, and jumping ahead 4 years later. And a lot of your listeners probably don't know much about the American participation because the U.S. was in the war for certainly a much shorter time than any of the other belligerents. The U.S. didn't get into the war until April of 1917. It didn't actually see real combat, until about a year later. And the story that I want to talk about with you took place in October of 1918. Nobody knew this, but the war was about to come to an end. But the fighting was still fierce, and a major operation was going on in part of the Western Front known as the Meuse-Argonne, Meuse being the Meuse River, and then the Argonne being the Argonne Forest. It was a large front, heavily fortified by the Germans, and they had been there since September of 1914, and the French were unable to push them out. So when the Americans became engaged in the war, they were assigned this front in what would be a grand offensive that took place towards the end of September. The Americans, though, they struggled. Jeff, they didn't have a lot of experience. They were good soldiers. They were good Marines, but they had a tough time against the Germans who, were really the masters of defense. And if you or any of the listeners have been to the Western Front and seen the battlefields, there's a lot of it still remaining. A lot of what it is are the concrete machine gun nests that the Germans built. They built these things to last. So they survived not only the First World War, but a lot of that same ground was fought over from 1940 to 45. So that part of France suffered significantly. But the Americans were adamant. They were under command of General John Pershing, who didn't have a whole lot of experience, but he was good as far as organizing men, and he was a brilliant leader as far as being able to work with the Allies. So the Americans are fighting their way through this Meuse-Argonne front, and a group of New Yorkers, New York soldiers that were part of an American division, the 77th, had been in the Argonne Forest since the end of September, and a battalion, as they were called, about 550 men, were cut off from the main body of the New York force, the 77th Division, and they ended up getting trapped deep into the Argonne Forest. It's very dense, and the German machine gun nests are all over the place, and they're cut off, and the rest of the Americans can't get to. Suddenly, one day, they're fighting, and then the fighting continues into the next day, and it lasts for over 5 days. And a newspaper reporter hears about these American troops that are cut off, and he starts poking around, and he wants a good story, and he gets his facts a little bit wrong. First off, he calls them a battalion. They weren't entirely a battalion. They were a mixture of troops, so they weren't all from the same regiment. Regiments then were broken into battalions. And he also said they were lost, and the lost part also was incorrect. Everybody knew where they were. It's just they were in a really difficult part of the forest, an area that they nicknamed the Pocket because they were deep into this ravine. And it was a great story for the reporter, and all of a sudden this myth of the so-called Lost Battalion gets splashed all over the newspapers. And it ultimately becomes a tragic story, because after more than 5 days of fighting, these more than 550 men, a little less than 200 of them, walk out of the forest. The others had been killed or captured. They had run out of supplies. They had run out of food. They had run out of medical equipment. They had run out of ammunition, and they had run out of water. And it was very difficult for the rest of the American troops to resupply them. They tried by airplane to drop supplies in. The supplies ended up going into the German lines. The Germans got fresh food while the Americans watched in horror. And then on the plane, on its way back to the airfield, crashed, was shot at, and the pilot and the co-pilot ended up getting killed. It was a miraculous story that finally, when these men got freed, it was something obviously they never forgot. Just to take the story forward, after the war, the commander of the so-called Lost Battalion, a New York lawyer by the name of Charles Whittle, he was haunted by this event, and he would get letters upon letters from some of the veterans who fought with him, seeking help, seeking some kind of benefit, seeking funds from the government, and he tried to help them out, but it got to a point where the pressure on him was too much, and in 1921, he went on a cruise ship on its way to Havana. He was seen at a bar that evening, and then he left, and he was never seen from again, never heard from again, and it's assumed that he jumped off the boat and committed suicide.
Wow.
So it's a tragic story, but it's also one of these sort of embellished stories, and it's kind of stood out as, along with Alvin York, who was the hero of the Meuse-Argonne, the hero of World War I. It's the story of this so-called Lost Battalion, but they were never lost. everyone knew where they were. It just took a matter of time to get to them. But it was such a tragic story because by the time that the American troops were able to break through the lines and rescue them, 3/4 of the men had died or were severely wounded.
Yeah. Do you know how many troops ended up dying or were wounded rescuing the Lost Battalion? It was probably huge.
It was a fair number. I don't know the exact number of men, but you're right. Because it was such a perilous situation, and you can see that area today. You can drive through. There's markers that show where the troops were, but I don't. That's a good question. I don't know the number. It was a combination of a couple of different divisions, plus the New Yorkers who broke through and were able to rescue these guys. So I don't know the exact number. And the fighting just continued and continued. And then you brought up earlier about 11/11/18. Well, finally, the Germans saw the tenacity of the Americans and recognized that they couldn't continue the war any longer. The Americans, by that time, had more than 2 million men and women overseas and another 2 million back in the United States that were planning to come over once shipping was available. Germans were heavily depleted in men and arms and equipment, and they had no capacity to rebuild. So in a lot of ways, I would argue that the Americans came in and maybe didn't serve as long as the other belligerents, but certainly turned the tide of the war.
Yeah, and even though 11/11/11, November 11th, 1918, was the armistice, the negotiating actually kept on going, and we're still, if you want to be technical, the end of the war, it was June 1918, or 1919, wasn't it, I think?
It was, and one of the reasons was when you think about what the definition of an armistice is, it's not a surrender, it's basically a ceasefire. So there was a lot of concern that the armistice could be broken at any moment. The Germans could say, well, all right, we don't like the way the negotiating is going, take too much of the blame for the war, and we're going to start up the fighting. And in fact, the fighting actually continued on November 11th up until 11 a.m. The Allied commander, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, had ordered the Allies, the Americans, the British, the French, to keep attacking because they were concerned that the Germans, if they said, okay, well, we know there's going to be an armistice, it's set for 11 a.m., but if we give up, say, fighting at 9 a.m., Germans could take the advantage of that and take the initiative and create another offensive, which could ruin the entire day. So Foch ordered the men to keep fighting, which meant that there were casualties right up until 11 a.m.
And I think, if I remember too, some of the people again back home kind of came after these generals and colonels for being aggressive. Don't you know that the war was going to end? Well, no, we didn't for sure. I think.
And in fact, Congress called some of the generals up to Capitol Hill in Washington and made them testify of why the fighting continued on. And it was simply for that reason. It was an armistice, but no one knew whether the Germans were going to abide by it.
Yeah, or let's face it, all the Allies on the front. Were the French going to obey the Americans? What if the French decided to actually launch a real offensive as a feint?
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly. So it was an exciting period in that day, but it was also very difficult. One soldier from Baltimore, Maryland, not far from where I live currently in Annapolis, Maryland, who died at 10:58 a.m. He stood up and decided to fire towards the German positions, and they retaliated with a machine gun but caught him. And he was considered the last American to die during the war.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just like we know Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia were the first casualties of World War I, we know who the final ones were too.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, that both ends of the spectrum are just incredibly sad. And going back to the beginning of our conversation, there's just so many of these what ifs. Had they had a reverse gear in the car and the driver would have been able to back up and get away from the would-be assassin.
Yeah,
maybe things would have changed.
Yeah, had Franz Ferdinand said, "No, let's skip the hospital. I feel like a martini. Let's just keep on going."
Yeah, exactly. And then a lot of the world hasn't been the same since.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of people blame World War II on the unfair terms of the Versailles Treaty.
Sure. It's also said that it's sort of World War I. World War II was basically a continuation of the First World War, and it certainly did bring a lot of bad feeling and the rise of Nazism in Germany, which sparked the Second World War. But, going back to Hitler, I'm sure as a lot of the viewers know, fought, and he fought bravely in World War I. He was somewhat of a hero, but he was an angry guy. He was a would-be artist, and had he been shown a little bit of appreciation in art school and somebody perhaps gave him some better lessons and encouraged him, maybe he would have gone off in that direction and we wouldn't have had World War II. It's hard to say.
Yeah, that reminds me, this is anecdotal, I'm not sure if it's true, but that Fidel Castro made a trip to the United States before the Great Revolution as a tryout as a pitcher for the Washington Senators, and they didn't pick him up. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it would be a peculiar story if true.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. I'd have to look up that one.
Yeah. Now, what do you think in the Versailles Treaty, of all the articles, what do you think was one of the least fair?
Well, I think the payment, the fact that they had to pay what ultimately became billions of dollars, and they actually didn't finish paying that until, I think it was 2010, so about 9 years ago. The fact that really Germany had to take the full brunt of the war, and I think that is unfair. Yes, the German troops were really the main belligerent early on and launched the first major offenses. But as you and I discussed at the top of the program, really the assassination of the Archduke was just the spark. And I think there would have been something else that would have brought Europe into war. And to say that the Germans were absolutely the main reason for the war and to take the brunt of it, I think that it's unfair. What do you think?
Well, I do, absolutely. And they loaded the Germans down with a lot of different articles and requirements that it's like 10 labors of Hercules. One of the more peculiar ones is Article 246. You won't mind if I kind of read that. We talk about this one. Okay, Article 246, and it's sliced up a bit, but within 6 months from the coming into force of the present treaty, Germany will hand over to His Britannic Majesty's government the skull of the Sultan Mukwawa, which was removed from the Protectorate of German East Africa and taken to Germany. What is up with that kind of requirements?
Yeah, I mean, how did they sneak that in? It's almost like when the American Congress sneaks in some rider to a bill just to appease some constituent, something that means nothing else to the rest of the country. I mean, how did that one get through, do you think? Nobody
actually states so at the time, but other people, maybe smarter than me, and certainly before you and I, started looking into it, like, who is Mukwawa? In the late 1800s, all of these European powers, the Germans, the Belgians, the French, the English, all had these little imperial protectorates in Africa, and the Germans themselves started kind of late. I think it was the 1870s, and they were trying to impose order in East Africa, and not all the tribes liked it, and so the Hihi, or the Hehe tribe, their leader was a Chief Mukwawa, and that in itself, Chief or Sultan, is shortened. Let me see. I have to pick up my piece of paper. Mukwavi Inyika Munyi Gimbua Mukwa Uyingawa, or shortened to Chief Mukwawa. And again, listeners on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, please don't correct me because I'll just cry. In the 1890s, he was, of course, anti-German, and so he led a revolt in his territory against the Germans. I think it was 1898. It took a couple of years, but they reduced his fortress. They were coming in, and rather than surrender, he committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. And the Germans collected his skull, or his head, and somebody later removed all the flesh. And then it kind of disappears from official documents. But somebody believed that it was eventually sent to one of these kind of museums of natural history in Germany. And the Germans actually did officially try to find it in these early 19-teens, and they never did. Almost 50 years later, it's post-World War II, and one of these British administrators started, for whatever reason, going through and cross-comparing World War II treaties and World War I treaties. The guy's name was Sir Edward Twining, and in 1953, he went to Bremen, Bremen is in the Netherlands, went to Bremen, Germany, and there were 2,000 skulls from from East Africa, and he looked at all of them. There were 2,000 skulls. 84 of these skulls were from East Africa. They had actually had them accessed. So he looked at them, and two criteria. This is so peculiar to me. To the criteria he looked at among all these skulls were they had taken skull measurements of living descendants of Chief Mokwawa. And so they had they had those family skull measurements. So they were looking at these skulls to see how round, how tall they were. And so they found a batch of those, and then they looked at that batch, and they picked out the one with the bullet hole in it.
Huh.
And so,
I guess that made sense.
Yeah. And as one of these articles says, the skull was finally returned on July 9th, 1954, and now resides in the Mokwawa Memorial Museum in Kalenga, near the town of Iringa, which is in Tanzania. But this is, I think, 50 years, the 50th anniversary of his death. Of all the things, talking about the bowmen and the angelic figures, this is one of these little strange things to go into a World War peace treaty.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me that was put in there, and so did they get so they got the skull back?
Yep, and they built a museum around it.
Wow. Okay. Then I guess it was a worthwhile endeavor.
Yeah. It used to be museums used to send out kind of expeditions to Aboriginal areas even into the very early 1900s where they went bone collecting. And that's why they passed the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act, NAGPRA.
Oh, okay.
I know I started out as an archaeologist, not a historian, and so it's the amazing thing some some societies decide to do for a hobby.
But it's more than it's pretty detailed work. It's more than just something that you pick up and you go to a field and start digging around. You've got to know what you're looking for, and you got to know what you're doing.
Yeah, you're right there. And the purpose was, I stand corrected, you're correct. The purpose was not just to have something sitting on your desk. It was for what they considered scientific purposes. Absolutely. Yeah. Now, the kind of as a follow-on, you remember we were talking about the reverberations of World War I. Did you see the Peter Jackson movie?
I did. I thought it was wonderful. How about you?
I did too. I encourage anyone who's listening. I think Netflix may be streaming it. Was it They Will Live Forever?
Yes.
And this is more Brit-centric. The Imperial War Museum in England came to Peter Jackson and said, "Hey, will you put together a compilation movie based on our recorded audio interviews and our silent film footage of World War I, and colorize it?" And it was just fantastic. Yeah,
it took the war. It's not a chronological story per se. It's not a history of World War I per se. And although, as you point out, it deals with the British troops, but it's looking at them more through the lens of what they experienced. And so you have to have a little bit of background about the war, I think, to understand, because they don't explain to you which battles they fought in, but you really get a true sense of what they might have experienced at the front, in the trenches, in shell holes, constantly under fire in horrible conditions. And I think that what that movie conveys more than anything.
Yeah, I think so too. And there are, like any war, there are some funny moments. See, they did these interviews probably in the 1950s or 60s with veterans, and when they're talking about field sanitation, and the troops, 5 or 6 troops sitting kind of on a log overhanging a latrine trench.
Yeah, and I know exactly what you mean.
And the log breaks and they all fall into the goo.
Yeah, right. It's comical and sad at the same time, because they probably didn't have a fresh uniform on hand, and to wipe themselves and to get clean wasn't as easy as we could think.
Yeah, and sadly but accurately, they cover all of the animals in World War II. The horses, the dogs, the homing pigeons. I thought it was very realistic, and they ended it. What was that one little body song? The British.
Was it a long way from Tipper? I can't remember.
No,
it's been a while since I've seen it.
No,
I don't remember.
Anyway, it was one of these waltzing Matilda kind of songs. Anyway, I encourage anybody to go see that movie, get it streaming, or it was traveling across the United States and it was so successful they like made a U-turn and started coming back. If any of our discussion about the odd and unusual and factual kind of interests you, please see that. This is the interesting thing about our society. People don't think it's real unless it's in color anymore. Not black and white. And
exactly.
And we aren't finished with World War I yet. For instance, I'm not going to go through this whole discussion with you. We're a little short on time, but in 2012, in a place called Carsponche in Alsace-Lorraine, eastern France, an excavation crew was working on a road project, and they found the remains of a filled-in 300-foot-long German trench system and the bodies of 21 German soldiers who were buried under mud, suffocated during the final months of the war. And it was like Pompeii. The preservation was so good because of lack of oxygen, they could read the newspaper that was sitting on a bench. And in 2017, somebody in the Alpines or the Alps came across a body that he eroded out of the glacier. And it was an Italian Alpini soldier who had been fighting against the Austro-Hungarian invaders.
Your point is well taken that there's always going to be remembrances of the war. I've been over to the battlefield on a number of occasions, and although I've never witnessed a skull or any sort of human fragment, but you do see remnants of the war that are very dangerous. There are still lots of unexploded ordnance, and the casualties, unfortunately, are still continuing because France, that part of France, is very agrarian, and farmers are tilling the fields for sugar beets and rapeseed and other crops that are vital to the economy. And it's not unusual that their tractors and other farm implements bang into a shell, and the cost is either badly maimed or killed. But you often see shells sitting on the side of the road waiting for one of the government agencies that handles ordnance to come by and take these things away.
Thank you for mentioning that, because that is a reminder to me of Bosnia in the 1990s. As we were driving through the Bosnian highways, sure enough, the farmers were deactivating the mines, and they were just put on the side of the road waiting for the United Nations bomb disposal people to pick them all up and take them somewhere else.
Right, and it's incredibly dangerous there. I haven't been to Bosnia, but the stories that I hear of young children and innocent civilians being named is horrible.
Yeah, that is one of the things that I will probably end up doing, not this year's vacation, but very, very soon, is now 20 years, going to see if they, say, fixed up the, was it the Hilton or was it the Holiday Inn, Sarajevo? That was the press center in those days. Yeah. So also, to any listeners, if you think a quick war, any war is going to be quick, you're absolutely wrong. This is history has shown that from just basic, what turn out to be just little civil wars end up going long, drawn-out conflicts. Yeah, and it's going on today with American troops still engaged in various parts of the Middle East, and it's just very tragic. Yeah, I agree. And having opened that wound, we're now pretty much run out of time. If somebody, it's been an enlightening discussion, and I'm glad that we're able to talk about these things, and as historians, be able to reflect back on that time and maybe take like a fresh approach to what's happened. Yeah, especially today. And if anyone is interested in looking you up, looking up your books, would you have any web links or any recommendations you can make? How to find Mitch? Well, the easiest way these days, I don't have a running website, but certainly Amazon or any of the online book dealers, you could just type my name in and you'll see my most recent book, 47 Days, plus a few others that I've written. And you just put my name in Google, often you'll find something related to me, good or mostly good. So it's pretty neat. But people can certainly find me. Okay, great. And
I appreciate you taking the time, Jeff, to call me, and this has been a lot of fun.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I did too. And I recommend any of Mitch's works. And if you happen to have an engagement somewhere where he doesn't have to fly too far, perhaps he might be one of your speakers. And I encourage that. And I thank everybody for listening, and you too, Mitch, for participating with me. It was good.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. You take care and have a good rest of the day.
All right. You too, and everybody else, good night.
Good night.
All right. If I can find where the switch is. See? You were smart not to turn off whatever passes for a radio or the on-off switch for this podcast, because I do have a few last-minute thoughts. The Peter Jackson documentary we talked about was called They Shall Not Grow Old, and Mitch and I both saw it when it crossed the country in theaters some months ago. It is already out on Blu-ray for about $20 US, and that should have the documentary where Peter Jackson talks about the making of the film and shows examples of the original footage and the colorized and repaired final prints. The song that they sung at the end for the credits, I'm going to mispronounce my French again, and that was Mademoiselle from Armistice, or if I should probably just be safer as calling it Hinky Dinky Parlez-Vous. And it was an earthy, slightly naughty song that soldiers would sing in bars, and some of them would make up verses. It's just a very, very long song, and Peter Jackson did clean it up a little bit for the movie credits, because who knows who's listening. I also wanted to mention the fact that for those of you who think there's nothing very spiritual about what I'm talking about, legends, true legends, something I'd ask you to think about is, and I know a lot of you tune into this network want stories about ghosts, for sure, and spiritualism and the paranormal investigating. As an after effect of World War I, there was a tremendous change in how Western Europe, the Western world, saw the theory and thoughts about ghosts and ghost huntings. Because so many people died in World War I, afterward their families needed some kind of closure, so many of them went to mediums and spiritualists. There was a huge increase in what was known as the American or the European Spiritualist Church, which is an evangelical form of Christianity. Some of you who are listening are probably members of the spiritual church of one denomination or other. Now, what ended up happening, of course, is as people were going to the mediums trying to find some kind of healing, the hucksters and the frauds showed up, took their money, and absconded. And of course, they were very quickly followed by people like Harry Houdini, who debunked what they were doing. Now, the aftermath of that for honest spiritualists, for honest mediums, and what we would now call paranormal investigators, is that they were made fun of and ridiculed as superstitious and idiots. And even today, talk to some people, and they would not want to be stigmatized by being called a spiritualist. So this is something that we're all dealing with even now. One last note, I promise. I had to add this at the end of the broadcast to clarify something. To some of you, when I was talking about Sarajevo, it may have sounded like there was an active military campaign and people were being shot at. I was there within a year of the end of fighting. We were there primarily on peacekeeping. However, we were still required to be armed, and there were still dangers, particularly out in the countryside. It was in later military missions that I deployed in the combat zone twice to Southwest Asia as part of what we still call, some of us, the global war on terrorism. So I hope that clarifies things. I am not trying to steal anybody's glory who was in Bosnia when there was combat, so I hope you understand. And with that, good night. Our theme music has been Dance Macabre by Camille Saint-Saëns, performed by Kevin MacLeod, www.incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0. Thank you for listening to The Peculiar World here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.